Marcus Johnson stood at the entrance of Westridge High School, taking a deep breath as he looked up at the brick building. It was his first day as a freshman, and butterflies danced in his stomach. At 14 years old, Marcus was tall for his age with a bright smile that could light up any room. His short, neatly trimmed hair had taken him 30 minutes to perfect that morning. "You got this," he whispered to himself, adjusting the straps of his backpack. The hallways buzzed with activity as students rushed to find their lockers and classrooms. Marcus noticed right away that he was one of only a handful of black students in the sea of faces. This wasn't surprising. Westridge was known for its lack of diversity, something his father had mentioned might change soon. What most people at Westridge didn't know was that Marcus's father, Dr. Elijah Johnson, had just been hired as the school's new principal. He wouldn't start for another 2 weeks, though. Both father and son had agreed it would be better for Marcus to begin school without everyone knowing about this connection. His father wanted him to make friends and form relationships based on who he was, not who his father was. "Excuse me, can you help me find room 203? Marcus asked a teacher standing in the hallway. The teacher, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, pointed down the corridor. "Take a right at the end of this hall, and it's the third door on your left." "Thanks," Marcus said with a smile. Following the directions, Marcus found his first class, English with Ms. Patricia Harmon. He stepped into the classroom and immediately felt several pairs of eyes on him. Finding an empty desk near the middle of the room, he sat down and placed his notebook on the desk. A girl with curly blonde hair leaned over from the desk next to his. "I'm Lily," she said with a friendly smile. "You must be new here." "Yeah, I'm Marcus. Just moved here last month." Their conversation was cut short as Ms. Harmon entered the classroom. She was a tall woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her lips were pressed into a thin line as she scanned the room, her gaze stopping briefly when it landed on Marcus. "Good morning, class," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "Welcome to 9th grade English. I'm Ms. Harmon, and I've been teaching at Westridge for 25 years. As she took attendance, Marcus noticed how her tone changed slightly when she reached his name. "Marcus Johnson," she called, looking up from her list with narrowed eyes. "Here," Marcus replied, raising his hand. Ms. Harmon stared at him for a moment longer than necessary before moving on to the next name. During the class, Marcus answered questions correctly and showed interest in the reading assignment. He loved books and reading had always been his strong point, but each time he spoke, Ms. Harmon seemed to find fault with his answers. "That's not quite what the author meant," she said coldly after Marcus shared his thoughts on the short story they were discussing. When another student gave a similar answer minutes later, Ms. Harmon nodded approvingly. By the end of the class, Marcus felt confused. Had he done something wrong? He couldn't think of anything. As the bell rang and students filed out, Ms. Harmon called out, "Marcus, a word please." Marcus approached her desk, wondering what she wanted. "Your hair," she said, looking at him with disapproval. "Make sure it stays neat and follows our dress code. We have standards at Westridge." Marcus touched his hair self-consciously. It was perfectly neat and professional. "Yes, ma'am," he replied politely, though confusion filled his mind. Walking to his next class, Marcus pushed his worries aside. It was just the first day. Things would get better. They had to. What Marcus didn't know was that Ms. Harmon's behavior today was just the beginning. The first week at Westridge High School passed quickly for Marcus. He made a few friends, including Lily from his English class and a boy named Tyler who sat with him at lunch. Most teachers were kind and helpful, but Ms. Harmon remained a dark cloud in his otherwise sunny days. On Monday of the second week, Marcus arrived at English class early. He took his usual seat and opened his notebook to review the homework, an essay about the main themes in To Kill a Mockingbird. "Did you finish the essay?" Lily asked, sliding into the desk beside him. Marcus nodded. "Stayed up late working on it. I really liked the book." Ms. Harmon walked in just as the bell rang. Her eyes landed on Marcus immediately, as if searching for something to criticize. She collected the essays, pausing at Marcus's desk. "I hope you followed the format instructions this time," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Marcus felt his cheeks grow warm. His previous assignment had received a C-, even though he had checked and double-checked the requirements. During class discussion, Ms. Harmon called on every student except Marcus. When he raised his hand to share his thoughts on racial injustice in the novel, she ignored him completely. After the fifth time, some students started to notice. "Ms. Harmon," Lily said suddenly, "I think Marcus has been trying to answer for a while." The teacher's lips tightened. "Very well. Marcus, what brilliant insight do you have to share with us?" The sarcasm in her voice was clear. Marcus hesitated but spoke anyway. "I think Atticus Finch shows courage by standing up for what's right, even when everyone around him disagrees." "That's a very basic observation," Ms. Harmon replied coldly. "I expected something more thoughtful." A few students exchanged uncomfortable glances. Tyler, who sat 2 rows behind Marcus, frowned. When Ms. Harmon returned their essays the next day, Marcus stared at his paper in disbelief. Another C-, with red marks all over the page. He had worked so hard on this essay. "Is everything okay?" Lily whispered, noticing his expression. Before he could answer, Ms. Harmon was standing over his desk. "Is there a problem with your grade, Mr. Johnson?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Marcus replied quietly, even though his heart felt heavy. After class, he stayed behind to look at the essays of students who had left their papers on their desks. Many had received A's and B's for work that seemed similar to his own. The pattern continued throughout the week. Ms. Harmon would make comments about Marcus's appearance, claiming his clothes were too casual, though he dressed exactly like other students. She moved his seat to the back corner to minimize distractions, though Marcus had never disrupted class. On Friday, things took an even uglier turn. "Marcus, your handwriting is nearly illegible," Ms. Harmon announced loudly as she returned their in-class assignments. "Perhaps you need extra practice with basic writing skills." Marcus looked down at his paper, confused. His handwriting was neat and clear. During group work, Ms. Harmon assigned students to teams of 4, except for Marcus, who was told to work alone. "I think you'll benefit from independent work," she explained when Lily asked why Marcus couldn't join their group. After class, Tyler approached Marcus in the hallway. "Dude, what's her problem with you?" he asked, anger clear in his voice. Marcus shrugged, trying to hide how much it bothered him. "I don't know. My older sister had her last year," Tyler said. "She said Ms. Harmon has issues with certain students." "What kind of students?" Marcus asked, already suspecting the answer. Tyler looked uncomfortable. "Students who look like you," he said quietly. That evening, Marcus sat at his desk at home, staring at his C- essays. He hadn't told his father about Ms. Harmon yet. Dr. Johnson was busy preparing to start his new position as principal, and Marcus didn't want to add to his stress. "It's just one class," he told himself. "I can handle it." But deep down, Marcus knew this was more than just tough grading. It was something uglier, something he shouldn't have to face alone. By the third week of school, Marcus couldn't ignore the situation with Ms. Harmon anymore. Her behavior had moved from subtle dislike to open hostility. Each day in English class became a challenge Marcus dreaded facing. On Monday morning, Marcus arrived to find his usual seat occupied by another student. "Sorry, Marcus," the boy said with an apologetic shrug. "Ms. Harmon told me to sit here from now on." Marcus looked around and saw the only empty desk was in the far corner, isolated from everyone else. He walked over and sat down, feeling all eyes on him. "Now that everyone is seated properly," Ms. Harmon said with a thin smile, "let's begin our lesson on proper grammar and speech." Throughout the class, she made pointed comments that seemed directed at Marcus. "Some people simply don't understand how to speak properly," she said while discussing dialects. "Proper English reflects proper upbringing." Several students glanced uncomfortably at Marcus. Lily caught his eye and gave him a sympathetic look. After class, Tyler waited for Marcus in the hallway. "This is getting weird, man," Tyler said. "Have you told anyone?" Marcus shook his head. "Who would believe me? She's been here forever, and I'm just the new kid." "We believe you," Lily said, joining them. "Me and Tyler have been keeping notes about what she says and does. It's not right." Marcus felt grateful but embarrassed. "Thanks, but I don't want to make trouble." That afternoon, Marcus saw the detention slip on his desk when he returned from sharpening his pencil. "What's this for?" he asked, confused. Ms. Harmon looked up from her desk. "For speaking out of turn." But I didn't. Are you arguing with me? She cut him off. That's another detention. Now Marcus had detention for both Tuesday and Wednesday after school. He hadn't done anything wrong, but arguing only made things worse. During Tuesday's detention, Ms. Harmon made Marcus write lines. I will respect authority and proper classroom behavior. He wrote quietly for an hour while she graded papers, occasionally glancing up to frown at him. On Wednesday, his father noticed how late he came home. Basketball practice run long? Dr. Johnson asked over dinner. Marcus pushed his food around on his plate. No, I had detention. His father put down his fork. Detention? For what? Speaking out of turn, supposedly, Marcus mumbled. Dr. Johnson studied his son carefully. Is everything okay at school, Marcus? You know you can talk to me. Marcus almost told him everything then, but stopped himself. His father was starting his new job as principal on Monday. What if complaining about Ms. Harmon made him look bad before he even started? It's fine, Dad, just a misunderstanding. On Thursday, things escalated further. During a group reading exercise, Ms. Harmon insisted that Marcus read a passage aloud. Louder and clearer, please, she interrupted after his first sentence. Use proper pronunciation. Marcus started again, reading perfectly clearly. Ms. Harmon sighed loudly. This is exactly what I mean about standards slipping. When I was a student, everyone knew how to speak properly. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ms. Harmon, Lily said suddenly, I think Marcus is reading just fine. The teacher's face hardened. Lily, you'll join Marcus in detention tomorrow. The class fell silent. Tyler discreetly pulled out his phone and began recording under his desk. After class, a small group gathered around Marcus. This is definitely racist, a girl named Emma said. My mom's a lawyer. You should report her. We'll back you up, Tyler added, showing Marcus he'd recorded the last part of class. Marcus felt a mix of emotions, anger, shame, and fear. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He didn't want to be a victim. He just wanted to learn and be treated fairly. That night, he sat on his bed staring at his phone. Ms. Harmon's comments were playing in his mind. His father knocked gently on his door. Can I come in? Dr. Johnson asked. Marcus nodded, quickly putting his phone away. Son, his father said, sitting beside him, I know something's bothering you. Whatever it is, we can face it together. Marcus almost told him then, but tomorrow was Friday, just one more day before the weekend. He could handle one more day. I'm just adjusting, Marcus said with a forced smile. Everything will be fine. Little did he know that tomorrow would change everything. Friday morning arrived with gray clouds hanging low in the sky. Marcus stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, running his hand over his carefully styled hair. He had spent extra time on it that morning, making sure every strand was perfect. Maybe if he looked extra neat today, Ms. Harmon would leave him alone. Looking sharp, his father said as Marcus came downstairs for breakfast. Dr. Johnson was reviewing some papers, preparation for his first day as principal on Monday. Ready for the last day of the week. As ready as I'll ever be, Marcus replied, forcing a smile. The hallways of Westridge High buzzed with Friday energy as students discussed weekend plans. Marcus walked to English class with a knot in his stomach. Lily and Tyler met him at the door. We got your back today, Tyler whispered, showing Marcus his phone. I've got it ready to record if anything happens. Inside the classroom, Ms. Harmon was writing on the board. Literary analysis, finding your voice. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Today, Ms. Harmon announced once everyone was seated, we'll be discussing how authors develop their unique perspective. Then you'll share your analysis of the chapter we read yesterday. The discussion began normally enough. Ms. Harmon called on various students, nodding approvingly at their answers. When Marcus raised his hand, she ignored him for the first 15 minutes. Finally, after he had been holding his hand up so long that it started to ache, she called on him with obvious reluctance. Yes, Mr. Johnson, you have something to add. Marcus straightened in his seat. I think the author uses the conflict between the two main characters to show how different perspectives can both be valid. Neither character is completely right or wrong. The classroom fell silent. It was a thoughtful analysis, and several students nodded in agreement. Ms. Harmon's eyes narrowed. That's completely incorrect. The author clearly shows that one perspective is morally superior. If you had read the chapter carefully, you would understand that. But the text says on page 83 that both characters, Marcus began. Are you arguing with me? Ms. Harmon's voice rose sharply. I have been teaching this book for 20 years. I'm not arguing, Marcus said quietly. I'm just pointing out what the text actually says. Several students were now pulling out their phones, discreetly positioning them to record what was happening. Lily had her book open to page 83, her finger pointing to the passage Marcus had referenced. Ms. Harmon's face flushed red. She marched down the aisle toward Marcus's desk. Stand up, she demanded. Marcus slowly got to his feet, confusion and fear mixing in his chest. You think you're so smart, don't you? Coming into my classroom and undermining my authority. No, ma'am, I just. The sound of the slap echoed through the suddenly silent classroom. Ms. Harmon's hand had struck Marcus across the face with enough force to make him stumble backward. Gasps filled the room. Tyler dropped his phone in shock but quickly recovered it, making sure it was still recording. Ms. Harmon, Lily cried out. But the teacher wasn't finished. Her face twisted with rage, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a pair of scissors. And this hair, she spat, grabbing a section of Marcus's carefully styled hair. It's distracting and unprofessional. The dress code clearly states. Before anyone could react, she closed the scissors around a chunk of Marcus's hair, cutting it off close to his scalp. The severed hair fell to the floor between them. The classroom erupted in chaos. Several students jumped to their feet. Someone ran to the door, yelling for help. Phones were now openly recording the scene. Marcus stood frozen, his hand on his burning cheek, staring at his hair on the floor. The sting of the slap was nothing compared to the humiliation and violation he felt. You can't do that, Tyler shouted, now standing beside Marcus protectively. Someone get the principal. Another student called out. Ms. Harmon seemed to suddenly realize what she had done. She took a step back, the scissors still in her hand. He was being disruptive, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The assistant principal, Mr. Rivera, appeared at the doorway, his face registering shock at the scene before him. What is going on here? He demanded. 20 voices began explaining at once, as Marcus stood silent, a section of his hair missing, and the truth of what he'd been enduring finally exposed for everyone to see. The classroom had turned into chaos. Mr. Rivera, the assistant principal, raised his hands to quiet the students who were all speaking at once. His eyes moved from the scissors in Ms. Harmon's hand to Marcus's face, red from the slap, and then to the hair on the floor. Everyone sit down except Ms. Harmon and Marcus, Mr. Rivera commanded, his voice firm but controlled. The rest of you, quiet. The students reluctantly returned to their seats, but phones remained out, still recording. Lily had tears in her eyes as she looked at Marcus. Ms. Harmon, put those scissors down on your desk right now, Mr. Rivera said. The teacher placed the scissors down slowly, her hand trembling slightly. The anger on her face had been replaced by something else, the first hints of fear. Marcus, are you all right? Mr. Rivera asked, approaching the boy. Marcus nodded, though he was far from all right. His cheeks still burned, and he could feel the cold spot on his head where his hair had been cut. Shame and anger mixed inside him, making it hard to speak. I need to see both of you in the office immediately, Mr. Rivera said. Class, Miss Peterson from next door will be here in a moment to supervise you. Stay in your seats. As Mr. Rivera led them toward the door, Tyler stepped forward. Sir, you need to see this, he said, holding out his phone. I recorded everything. And it's not just today. She's been treating Marcus unfairly for weeks. Mr. Rivera took the phone and glanced at the screen. His expression darkened as he watched for a few seconds. Thank you, Tyler. Please email this video to me right away. Anyone else who recorded what happened, please do the same. In the hallway, Mr. Rivera spoke into his radio, requesting another administrator to come to Ms. Harmon's classroom. He then escorted Marcus and Ms. Harmon to the main office in silence. Once inside, he directed them to separate rooms. Marcus was taken to the school nurse first to check his face, while Ms. Harmon waited in a conference room. Does it hurt much? The nurse asked gently, examining the red mark on his cheek. It's okay. Marcus said quietly, though it still stung. I'm going to take a photo for the record, if that's all right, she said, picking up a camera. Marcus nodded. After the nurse finished, Mr. Rivera took Marcus to his office where the school counselor, Mrs. Chen, was waiting. Marcus, I need you to tell us exactly what happened, not just today but in the past weeks as well, Mr. Rivera said. Marcus took a deep breath and started talking. Once he began, everything poured out: the unfair grading, the isolation, the constant criticism, the detentions for nothing, and finally, today's humiliation. As he spoke, Mrs. Chen took detailed notes. Why didn't you report this earlier? She asked gently. Marcus looked down at his hands. My dad is starting his new job soon. I didn't want to cause problems. Mr. Rivera and Mrs. Chen exchanged confused glances. Your father's new job? Mr. Rivera asked. Before Marcus could explain, there was a knock at the door. The school secretary poked her head in. I have several students here who say they need to speak with you about what happened in Ms. Harmon's class. Outside the office, a group had formed. Lily, Tyler, and 5 other students stood waiting, determined looks on their faces. We all saw what happened, Lily said firmly. And we've been watching how she treats Marcus for weeks, added Emma. It's not right. I have screenshots of all the assignments where she graded him unfairly, another student said, holding up his phone. Mr. Rivera looked surprised but nodded. Thank you all for coming forward. We'll need statements from each of you. As the students were organized into a waiting area, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his father. Just checking in. How's your day going? Marcus stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. He didn't want his father to worry, but everything had changed now. The truth was coming out. Mrs. Chen noticed his expression. Is that your parents? She asked. We should call them. It's my dad, Marcus said quietly. What's his number? I'll call them now, Mr. Rivera said, picking up his office phone. Marcus hesitated, then said, You don't need his number. His name is Dr. Elijah Johnson. Dr. Johnson? Mr. Rivera repeated, confusion crossing his face. Not the same Dr. Johnson who's starting as our new principal on Monday? Marcus nodded slowly. That's my dad. Mr. Rivera's eyes widened in shock, and Mrs. Chen gasped softly. The pieces were suddenly falling into place. The school board meeting room was filled with tension. Ms. Harmon sat stiffly at one end of the long table, her attorney beside her. On the opposite side sat Mr. Rivera and the superintendent, Dr. Martinez. The emergency meeting had been called within hours of the incident. Marcus waited outside with Mrs. Chen, the school counselor. His face no longer showed the red mark from the slap, but the missing chunk of hair was impossible to hide. He had received dozens of supportive messages from classmates, including videos that documented what had happened. Inside the meeting room, Miss Harmon was defending herself. The boy was being disruptive and challenging my authority, she insisted, her voice sharp. I admit I reacted strongly, but he has been a problem student since day one. A problem how exactly? Dr. Martinez asked, her expression stern. Ms. Harmon straightened her blouse. He speaks out of turn, questions my teaching methods, and doesn't respect the classroom standards I've maintained for 25 years. We've reviewed the student statements, Mr. Rivera said, gesturing to a thick folder. 17 students from your class have provided written accounts of how you've treated Marcus Johnson. They'd all tell a very different story. Those children don't understand. We've also seen the videos, Dr. Martinez interrupted. Multiple recordings that show you slapping a student and cutting his hair without permission. Can you explain that? Ms. Harmon's attorney whispered something in her ear. She nodded and then spoke again. His hair violated dress code standards. As for the physical contact, I was reacting to his threatening posture. The door to the meeting room opened. All heads turned to see who had arrived. A tall, distinguished-looking man in a gray suit entered the room. His presence commanded immediate attention. I apologize for interrupting, he said in a deep, calm voice. I'm Dr. Elijah Johnson. Ms. Harmon's face showed confusion, then recognition at the name. She had heard the school was getting a new principal, but she hadn't met him yet. Dr. Johnson, we weren't expecting you until Monday, the superintendent said, standing to shake his hand. I received a concerning call about an incident involving a student, Dr. Johnson replied. His eyes moved to Ms. Harmon, studying her carefully. Yes, we're discussing that now, Dr. Martinez explained. A teacher physically assaulted a student today and cut his hair without consent. I'd like to hear more about this situation, Dr. Johnson said, taking a seat next to the superintendent. Ms. Harmon shifted uncomfortably in her chair. As I was explaining, the student was being disruptive and... Which student? Dr. Johnson asked quietly. A freshman named Marcus Johnson, Mr. Rivera answered. Dr. Johnson's expression remained calm, but his eyes hardened. I see. And may I ask, Ms. Harmon, is this the first time you've had issues with this student? Ms. Harmon hesitated, feeling suddenly uneasy about the direction of questioning. He's been problematic since he arrived. Some students just don't fit the Westridge culture. And what culture is that exactly? Dr. Johnson asked, his voice still even. A culture of excellence and proper behavior, she replied firmly. Some students come from backgrounds that don't prepare them for our standards. A heavy silence fell over the room. Dr. Martinez and Mr. Rivera exchanged glances. Ms. Harmon, Dr. Johnson said after a moment, would you mind explaining what you mean by backgrounds? She faltered, realizing she might have said too much. I simply mean some students aren't raised with the same values in education. Dr. Johnson nodded slowly. I'd like to meet this student before we continue. The superintendent pressed a button on the intercom. Please send in Marcus Johnson. The door opened again, and Marcus entered. His eyes immediately found his father, and relief washed over his face. Ms. Harmon's mouth fell open. Her gaze darted between Marcus and Dr. Johnson, the resemblance unmistakable. Ms. Harmon, Dr. Johnson said, standing and placing a protective hand on his son's shoulder, I'd like to formally introduce you to my son, Marcus. The student whose hair you cut today. The student you've been discriminating against for weeks. The color drained from Ms. Harmon's face as the full reality of the situation crashed down on her. Her attorney shifted uneasily beside her. I didn't know, she stammered. Would it have mattered if you did? Dr. Johnson asked, his calm voice carrying the weight of his position and his anger. Would you have treated him fairly if he'd known he was the principal's son? The answer hung in the air, unspoken but clear to everyone in the room. The news spread through Westridge High School like wildfire. By Monday morning, everyone knew what had happened in Ms. Harmon's English class and the shocking revelation that followed. Students gathered in small groups in the hallways, discussing the events in hushed voices that fell silent whenever teachers walked by. Did you see the video? A sophomore whispered to her friend at a nearby locker. It's all over social media now. Indeed, despite the school's efforts to handle the situation privately, several videos of Ms. Harmon slapping Marcus and cutting his hair had made their way online. Local news stations had picked up the story by Sunday evening, though they carefully blurred Marcus's face and didn't mention his name due to his age. At the Johnson household, the phone had been ringing constantly. Dr. Johnson sat at the kitchen table early Monday morning, speaking quietly into his cell phone. Yes, I understand this is a sensitive situation, he said to the superintendent. I agree we need to address it directly. Marcus entered the kitchen, his hair freshly cut by a professional barber who had managed to blend the chopped section as best as possible. He still felt self-conscious about it, but at least it looked intentional now rather than hacked off. Ready for school? Dr. Johnson asked, ending his call. Marcus nodded, though his stomach was in knots. Everyone will be staring at me. Probably, his father agreed. But you've done nothing wrong. Hold your head high. When they arrived at Westridge, news vans were parked across the street. Dr. Johnson guided Marcus through a side entrance to avoid the reporters. Inside, Mr. Rivera met them with a grim expression. The school board's decision was unanimous, he said, walking alongside them toward the main office. Ms. Harmon's employment has been terminated, effective immediately. What about the police investigation? Dr. Johnson asked. The district attorney's office is reviewing the evidence. They'll decide whether to file assault charges. As they walked through the hallways, students and teachers alike stopped to stare. Some offered supportive nods or smiles to Marcus. Others simply watched with wide eyes as the new principal and his son passed by. In the main office, a group was waiting for them, the superintendent, the school board president, and a woman Marcus didn't recognize. Marcus, this is Ms. Carter from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education, Dr. Johnson explained. She'd like to speak with you about what happened. For the next hour, Marcus once again recounted his experiences with Ms. Harmon. This time, he held nothing back. Ms. Carter took detailed notes, occasionally asking questions about specific incidents. You're not alone in this, she told him when they finished. We've received reports about Ms. Harmon's behavior toward minority students going back several years. Why wasn't anything done before? Dr. Johnson asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Complaints were filed, but there was never enough evidence, Ms. Carter explained. The videos from Friday changed that. When Marcus finally headed to his classes, he found his friends waiting for him. Lily, Tyler, and Emma surrounded him protectively as they walked to math class. Everyone's talking about how brave you were, Lily told him. I wasn't brave, Marcus said quietly. I just sat there while she cut my hair. You were brave every day you came to class, knowing how she'd treat you, Tyler insisted. Outside the school, the story continued to grow. By lunchtime, national news networks had picked up the incident. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #RacismandSchools. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the teacher's actions and calling for a broader investigation into discrimination at Westridge. Ms. Harmon's attorney released a brief statement claiming his client had been under extreme stress and that the incident was being mischaracterized. This only fueled more outrage online. After school, Dr. Johnson held his first official meeting as principal with the entire faculty. Though it was supposed to be his introductory meeting, the agenda had completely changed. What happened to my son is unacceptable, he told the silent room of teachers, but it's also a symptom of a larger problem that we must address together. As he outlined plans for mandatory cultural sensitivity training and a review of disciplinary practices, Dr. Johnson knew this was just the beginning. The legal proceedings against Ms. Harmon would likely continue for months, but the work to change the culture at Westridge needed to start immediately. For the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of purpose rising above his anger. This wouldn't just be about justice for Marcus. It would be about ensuring no student ever experienced what his son had endured. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in Ms. Harmon's classroom. Spring sunshine streamed through the windows of Westridge High School as students moved through the hallways between classes. Marcus Johnson stood by the bulletin board in the main hallway. Need some help with that? Lily asked, approaching with Tyler beside her. Got it, Marcus said, stepping back to make sure the poster hung straight. Did you finish the presentation for tomorrow's assembly? All done, Tyler confirmed. Emma added some great statistics about how disciplinary actions have changed this semester. The numbers told a powerful story. Since Dr. Johnson had implemented new policies, suspensions had decreased by 40% overall, with the biggest drop seen among minority students. Teachers now receive monthly training on cultural awareness and bias recognition. As students passed by, several greeted Marcus with high fives or friendly nods. His position had changed dramatically from that nervous new student to someone most of the school now knew and respected. There's your dad, Lily said, nodding toward the end of the hallway. Dr. Johnson was walking with Mr. Rivera, deep in conversation. In 6 months as principal, he had transformed Westridge in ways both visible and invisible. The atmosphere felt different, more inclusive, more conscious. Marcus, Dr. Johnson called, noticing his son. Got a minute? Marcus excused himself from his friends and joined his father and Mr. Rivera. The school board just called, Dr. Johnson said, a satisfied expression on his face. They'd approved our proposal for the mentorship program. This had been Marcus's idea, a program pairing new students with older ones to help them navigate school life, with special attention to students from underrepresented backgrounds. That's great news, Marcus said, feeling a surge of pride. Your idea, your program, Mr. Rivera said with a smile. The board was very impressed. As they continued discussing details, Marcus caught sight of a familiar face on the wall-mounted TV in the hallway. The sound was muted, but the headline was clear. Former teacher pleads guilty in student assault case. Ms. Harmon's face filled the screen briefly before the news segment moved on. Her legal troubles had continued for months after her firing. Faced with overwhelming evidence from videos and witness statements, she had finally agreed to a plea deal rather than face a full trial. "Did you see?" Mr. Rivera asked, following Marcus's gaze to the TV. Marcus nodded. "Mom told me this morning that it was happening today." "How do you feel about it?" his father asked carefully. Marcus considered the question. The anger he'd felt those first few weeks had gradually faded, replaced by something more complex. "I'm glad it's almost over," he said finally. Under the plea agreement, Ms. Harmon would never teach again. She also faced community service hours and mandatory training on racial bias. The civil lawsuit filed by the Johnson family had been settled out of court, with the money going to establish a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing education degrees. Later that afternoon, Marcus led the weekly meeting of the Student Diversity Council in the library. 20 students from various backgrounds sat in a circle, discussing plans for the upcoming Cultural Heritage Month. "I think we should focus on personal stories," Marcus suggested. "Real experiences from our own families and communities." As the discussion continued, Dr. Johnson watched quietly from the doorway, pride evident on his face. From a painful incident had grown something meaningful. His son had transformed from victim to leader, using his experience to create positive change. When the meeting ended, students filed out chatting excitedly about their plans. Marcus gathered his notebooks and noticed his father waiting. "Ready to head home?" Dr. Johnson asked. "Almost," Marcus replied. "Just need to check on one more thing." As they walked together down the hallway, a small freshman boy approached them nervously. "Marcus, I was wondering if I could join the council meetings," he said hesitantly. "I wasn't sure if it was too late in the year." "It's never too late," Marcus said with a warm smile, remembering his own first days at Westridge. "We meet every Thursday. You're welcome anytime." The boy's face brightened. "Thanks. I'll be there next week." As Marcus and his father continued toward the exit, Dr. Johnson put his arm around his son's shoulders. "You know, I'm incredibly proud of you," he said quietly. Marcus smiled. The pain of that day 6 months ago hadn't disappeared completely, but from it had grown strength, purpose, and a determination to make Westridge High School a better place for everyone. Outside, the spring air felt fresh and full of possibility. What had started as one of the worst days of Marcus's life had, in time, led to some of the best.